A land without a people, for a people without a land. Now, why did the Zionists think that there are no people in the land of Palestine? The history of Palestine and how it's recorded and narrated is highly uneven. Even though it's one of the most documented countries in the Middle East, the documentation is quite skewed. On one hand, thousands of books and articles exist, and they're all about subjects and people that are deemed worthy of studying. And on the other hand, entire centuries, entire social groups, and fundamental issues, they're completely left out of the conversation. And Palestinian historians have only recently started to shine a light on the glaring gap that exists in the history and documentation of the ruler people of Palestine. And this video, we're going to talk about how the existence of Palestinian people has been slowly erased out of history. And to do that, we're going to basically be analyzing the type of literature, the historical literature that's available on Palestinians. For the sake of understanding, I'm going to divide these categories up. As always, all of my work is based off of research, and you can find links below, and I do encourage you to do your own research as well. And also, please subscribe. Thank you. So the first category, we're going to call it traditional versus modernism narrative. So in the past, a lot of Arab, Israeli, and Western historians have painted a very stark black and white picture of the Palestinian history. Most historians begin telling their histories from the Ottoman Empire, roughly from around the 17th to the 19th century. And a lot of books and literature basically shows that this is the general area of the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and it is in that tone that the entire story is narrated. And with the decline, it also says that there is a stagnation of growth. Due to this narrative, there are such sudden differences seen between the traditional times and the modern times that come afterwards, that anything that happened before the 17th century is basically kind of covered in the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and also deemed unworthy to study because there could have been nothing before that, because that's all traditional. What does it matter? We can kind of get a sense of how this is true because by the year 1992, there are zero studies done in the English language regarding Palestine before the 17th century. And there are only two studies that exist during the 18th century. So we see the historians who are pointing out this gap, they're absolutely correct because there were no studies. Now we come to the modernism part of the narrative. The writings on the modern times basically take their start from the arrival of a foreign entity in the land. And now this entity can be in the form of a couple of things. It can be Napoleon in 1798, the modernized Egyptians of Muhammad Ali in 1831, or the first wave of European Jewish settlers in 1882. And it is from that point onwards that these books basically start talking about a modern Palestine. Again, emphasizing that sharp contrast between traditional and modern. So we see that in this narrative, the cultural development of the rural people of Palestine before the 17th century and even during the 17th and 19th century is completely ignored, and it's kind of wrapped up in the guise of the decline of the Ottomans, right? Okay. Now we move on to our second category, and that is writings about nationalism. In the last century, Zionists and Palestinians have basically embarked on a journey of reconstructing or rediscovering their pasts in a way that basically fits into their current national ideologies. And this isn't something that we only see with the case of Israel and Palestine. This is something that's happening worldwide. Now, this approach is problematic for a couple of reasons. Now, since most work on the Ottoman Empire revolves around the decline of the Ottomans, and works regarding the modern state are basically works where foreign entities come in and then the modernization begins. A lot of those works are actually written through the lens of European Orientalism. And there is a general way that the European histories basically go. Their histories in the 1800s revolved around them going to new places, and with them they're going to be taking civilization and enlightenment. And then there are other societies who are not civilized, and then they'll be civilizing them. Their histories revolve around telling the world that how they managed to do what and what. What and who the others are is pretty much irrelevant. We also find glaring gaps in a lot of these colonial histories because Europeans would generally find the way that these societies would preserve their own histories, like oral narration or any other forms, as inferior and untrustworthy and thus dismissible. So again, we see that the local population basically is omitted from the narrative, and the narrative we're seeing is from the perspective of an imperial power coming in. So, interestingly enough, in the case of Palestine, the European histories actually don't just talk about power struggles and resistance. There is another factor at play. And that brings us to our third category, religious histories. A huge chunk of the Palestinian history written in English revolves around the religious importance of the area. In European texts, you see it as the birthplace of Christianity, the home of Judaism, and in general, the Holy Land. Now, this resulted in them having a very high volume of books which revolved around these themes, but the thing is, the topics that were circulating in these books were very specific. According to the historian Doumani, if you made a graph of 19th century books on Palestine according to the topics they covered, we would see two rather conspicuous spikes. And these would be over the biblical and the Crusader periods, because these two are the most interrelated to European history. So naturally, that's what they're going to be talking about. The era of Arab and Muslim rule over these lands is basically largely ignored. But historians now argue that it must have been exactly that time during which the culture and society of modern-day Palestine must have evolved. So within the religious studies topic, there's another subtopic that's basically very important, and that is the city of Jerusalem. So we see a lot of books which revolve around the city itself, and they also follow certain themes. Now, even though obviously Jerusalem is a part of Palestinian history, but it doesn't encompass all of it, because for majority of the historical time period, Jerusalem was only about 20% of the population of the entirety of the Palestinian area. 80% of the people lived in rural areas and did not lead the city life. So historical books on Jerusalem basically revolve around travel guides for tourists, and historical geographies that revolve around physical features of current-day Palestine and Jerusalem. So we see through these categories that even though this is one of the most written about country in the Middle East, but the people of Palestine are nowhere found in these writings. And for the most part, Palestinians are not even the ones writing these histories. And there's a good reason for that, because they were never given the infrastructure. It's only as recently as the 1950s that original research has finally started using Ottoman archives and local sources. And now we're finally hearing Palestinians write their own history. If you want to learn more about how this gap is being bridged, let me know in the comments below. See you next time.